Before fast food, before microwaves, before grocery stores were full of choices, families survived on meals that cost just a few cents. Some of those meals came from potato peels, others from scraps most people would throw away today. But these simple dishes fed an entire generation during the hardest years in history. Tonight, let's step back into Grandma's kitchen and discover the forgotten meals that kept families alive. Later in this video, I'll tell you about the strangest dessert ever made during the Great Depression, a pie made almost entirely from water. Before we continue, I'm curious, did your grandparents ever cook meals like this? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what simple dish you remember most. One of the first meals I remember learning to make was macaroni and cheese. Now don't laugh, because it wasn't the kind that comes in a bright box with powdered cheese. No, Grandma made it from scratch. She'd melt butter in a pan, sprinkle in flour, and slowly pour milk while stirring with a wooden spoon. I remember standing beside her, watching the sauce slowly turn thick and creamy. Then she'd stir in the cheese, real cheese grated by hand. That macaroni would go into a baking dish topped with crushed crackers and baked until the top turned golden brown. That whole meal could feed 6 people for less than 50 cents. And when money was tight, that bubbling pan of macaroni and cheese felt like a miracle. But if there was one food that truly saved families back then, it was potatoes. Potatoes were cheap, filling, and easy to find. On cold evenings, my mother would peel a pile of them at the kitchen table. She'd dice them with onions and toss everything into a pot with water. Sometimes, if we were lucky, she added milk. That pot would simmer all afternoon. No cream, no fancy seasoning, just potatoes slowly melting into a thick, warm soup. During the Great Depression, potatoes cost about 2 cents a pound, and that simple soup kept many families from going to bed hungry. To this day, the smell of simmering potatoes and onions still reminds me of home. You see, back then we had a rule in our house. Nothing went to waste, not even potato peels. After peeling potatoes, my mother would scrub those skins clean and toss them into another pot. Add onions, a little flour, salt, and before long, you had potato peel soup. It might sound strange today, but when food was scarce, every scrap mattered. Government posters during World War II even encouraged people to cook like that. And you know what? Those humble little soups carried a lot of families through very hard winters. But the cleverest dessert I ever saw my grandmother make was something called water pie. Now imagine that, a pie made mostly from water. When families couldn't afford milk or eggs, Grandma would fill an empty pie crust with water, sugar, flour, butter, and vanilla. Then she'd bake it. And somehow, magically, that watery mixture turned into something that tasted like custard. It wasn't fancy, but it was sweet. And sometimes a little sweetness was enough to remind people that better days would come. But the most interesting thing in our kitchen was a pot that never seemed to stop cooking. We called it the soup pot, and it lived on the back burner of the stove almost every day. Whenever vegetables were chopped, the scraps went into that pot. Wilted greens, old carrots, potato skins, they all went in. If we had bones left from a roast, those went in too. Even the water from boiling vegetables was poured into the pot. Day after day, the broth grew richer. New ingredients joined the old ones. Some people jokingly called it garbage soup, but in truth, it was survival soup, because no matter how empty the pantry looked, that pot always held something warm and nourishing. And sometimes that was the difference between going to bed hungry or going to bed satisfied. Looking back now, those meals might seem simple, maybe even poor. But when you've lived through hard times, you learn something important. Good food isn't about expensive ingredients. It's about creativity. It's about care. And it's about making sure the people you love never leave the table hungry. And that was something our grandmothers knew better than anyone. Some meals didn't need fancy ingredients. They just needed time. One of the most dependable meals in our house was a pot of rice and beans. Dried beans were cheap back then, just a few cents for a whole pound, but cooking them took patience. My mother would wash the beans carefully, picking out little stones that sometimes hid among them. Then she soaked them overnight in a bowl of water. The next morning, the beans went into a big pot on the stove, and that pot stayed there almost all day, slowly simmering, slowly softening. If we were lucky, my mother dropped in a ham bone from Sunday dinner. Sometimes it was just a small piece of salt pork, but even that tiny bit of meat gave the whole pot a deep, rich flavor. The smell of beans cooking all afternoon filled the house, and when dinner came, that single pot could feed 8 people easily. A scoop of rice, a ladle of beans, maybe a slice of bread. It wasn't fancy, but it kept everyone strong enough to work another long day. Mondays were laundry days in most homes back then, and laundry wasn't easy. There were no machines humming in the corner. Clothes had to be scrubbed by hand, rinsed, wrung out, and hung outside to dry. So women needed a meal that didn't demand too much attention. That's why rice and beans were perfect. You could set the pot on the stove and let it simmer slowly while the rest of the day was spent washing, scrubbing, and hanging clothes on the line. By evening, the beans were tender, the broth rich, and the whole family gathered around the table for a meal that had been quietly cooking all day long. Another meal that filled many hungry stomachs was gravy and biscuits. Now today, people throw away meat drippings without a second thought, but our mothers treated that fat like treasure. After cooking meat, they carefully saved every drop. The fat went into a pan. Flour was stirred in slowly. Then milk or water was added while the mixture thickened. That simple process created a rich gravy. Pepper was sprinkled generously over the top. Sometimes there was almost no meat in the gravy at all, but that didn't stop anyone from enjoying it. Fresh biscuits were baked from flour and lard, soft on the inside, golden on the outside, and when that hot gravy was poured over them, well, that meal could satisfy even the hungriest worker. Which of these dishes surprised you the most so far? Was it the potato peel soup or the water pie? Let me know in the comments. These weren't just recipes. For many families, these meals meant the difference between going to bed hungry and going to bed warm and full. If potatoes were the hero of the pantry, then cabbage was the quiet workhorse of the garden. Cabbage grew easily, it lasted through cold winters, and it cost almost nothing. My grandmother often made braised cabbage with sausage. She sliced the cabbage into thick ribbons, then she dropped them into a pot with cheap sausage. As the sausage cooked, its fat slowly melted into the cabbage. What started as a simple vegetable became rich and flavorful. One pot could last for days, and every time it was reheated, the flavor grew even better. For many immigrant families who came from Europe, this dish carried memories from the old world. It reminded them of home. Another humble ingredient that helped many families survive was lentils. Back then, nobody talked about lentils being a superfood. They were simply cheap and reliable. Unlike other beans, lentils didn't need soaking overnight. You could rinse them and cook them immediately. My mother simmered them with onions and carrots when we had them, but during the hardest times, it might just be lentils, water, and salt. And even that simple soup provided enough protein to keep a family going. 1 pound of lentils could stretch across 2 whole days of meals. And when you're feeding a house full of hungry children, that matters more than anything. Meat was expensive, much too expensive to serve every day, so mothers found clever ways to stretch it. One of those ways became known as the sloppy Joe. My mother would cook a pound of ground beef in a pan, but she didn't stop there. To stretch that meat further, she added breadcrumbs, aimed thick and saucy. Finally, she spooned the meat onto soft buns. It might have been messy to eat, but for children, biting into that overflowing sandwich felt like a feast, and 1 pound of meat could suddenly feed an entire family. When meat simply wasn't an option, eggs became the star of the kitchen. Egg salad sandwiches were everywhere. Hard-boiled eggs were mashed in a bowl, then mixed with mayonnaise, mustard, chopped pickles, salt, and pepper. The mixture was spread thickly between slices of bread. Eggs were cheap. A dozen cost only about 15 cents in the 1940s. That meant plenty of protein for very little money. Workers packed egg salad sandwiches in lunch pails. Children carried them to school, and families relied on them whenever budgets grew tight. In many Southern homes, one meal held almost sacred status: cornbread and pinto beans. A pot of beans simmered slowly with a little salt pork or ham hock. Next to it, a cast iron skillet held cornbread baking in the oven. Cornmeal was cheaper than wheat flour, and it baked into a hearty bread with a rustic texture. But the real magic came when the meal was served. A piece of cornbread was broken apart and dipped into the rich bean broth. That broth had a special name. People called it pot liquor, and it carried all the flavor of the beans and meat. Together, that simple combination created a complete meal. Protein, carbohydrates, energy for the whole day, and not a single crumb went to waste. Leftovers were never ignored, especially rice. If rice remained from dinner, my mother spread it onto a plate overnight. That helped it dry slightly. The next day, she fried it in a pan. Eggs went in, maybe a few vegetables, sometimes tiny pieces of leftover meat. Instead of soy sauce, many families used Worcestershire sauce for flavor. What started as yesterday's plain rice became a completely new meal, crispy, savory, and far too delicious to waste. When summer heat filled the house, cooking large meals on the stove could make the kitchen unbearable, so families turned to simple meals that didn't require much cooking. One favorite was hot dogs with macaroni salad. Hot dogs were cheap, sometimes only 10 cents a pound. Macaroni salad was made from leftover pasta mixed with mayonnaise, pickles, and spices. It was cool. As the years moved forward and the world slowly recovered from hard times, new foods began appearing in kitchens across the country. One of the most popular was something called tuna casserole. Canned foods were becoming more common, and canned tuna quickly became a favorite. It was cheap, it lasted a long time on the shelf, and most importantly, it didn't need refrigeration. For families that still didn't own a modern refrigerator, that was a blessing. My mother would mix canned tuna with egg noodles and cream of mushroom soup. Then she poured the mixture into a baking dish. The final touch was crushed crackers sprinkled over the top. Once it baked in the oven, the casserole turned golden and bubbly. That single dish could feed 6 people easily, and the smell of it baking in the kitchen meant dinner was almost ready. For many families, tuna casserole became the symbol of a new era, where convenience slowly started meeting tradition. But even as new foods arrived, some old traditions never disappeared. One of my favorite memories was baking potatoes in the fireplace. Instead of using an oven, we simply wrapped potatoes in foil or cloth and placed them near the hot coals. Slowly, over time, they baked right there in the fire. The skins became crispy, the inside turned soft and fluffy, and they picked up a faint, smoky flavor that no oven could ever recreate. When the potatoes were ready, we sliced them open and filled them with whatever we had. Sometimes it was leftover chili, sometimes a little butter, sometimes just salt and pepper. But when you held that hot potato in your hands on a cold evening, it felt like the warmest meal in the world. There's a meal that still reminds many people of childhood: grilled cheese and tomato soup. The bread would be toasted in a pan until it turned golden brown. Inside, the cheese melted slowly into a soft, stretchy layer. Beside it was a bowl of tomato soup. Often it came from a simple can. During wartime, butter was rationed, so families discovered something clever. Instead of butter, they spread mayonnaise on the bread before grilling. It browned beautifully and made the crust even crispier. Dipping that sandwich into warm tomato soup created a perfect balance: creamy, savory, comforting. It was the kind of meal that made difficult days feel a little easier. And if you enjoy stories about forgotten recipes, old traditions, and the history of everyday life, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because in our next video, we'll uncover even more hidden stories from the kitchens of the past.